Okay, the recording and transcription have started, so you can still put things into the chat, but if you speak or come on camera, be aware that you will be recorded. So, as I said, today we're going to be talking about ITIL, the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and COBIT. And we will start with COBIT. No, we won't. We'll start with ITIL. So, the Information Technology Infrastructure Library is a way of trying to put some sort of structure onto IT procurement and IT use. I'm not entirely sure how long this cold lasts, but it seems to be 2 months at the moment. Now, before we get started on ITIL, excuse me, for the non-IT people, like I say, it's as well to be aware of other types of system, even if you're not directly involved in them. So when we're going over these, try and think of them not as IT specific. Try to think of them as frameworks on how you might consult on or design or implement any sort of procured system. So anything that you're trying to put into your organization. If you're going out to lease a new office, you'd kind of want to know what people in the organization needed from that new office. So you'd consult. You'd want to know about the layout, so you'd design it. And you do all that before you actually signed a lease and implemented getting a new building. So we're looking at it in terms of IT, and clearly it is ITIL. I'm not trying to pretend that it's not, but it has a wider relevance. And if you can think of it as that kind of exemplar and realize that you don't actually have to be an IT expert to understand it, and indeed for the assessment, you certainly don't have to be an IT expert. Simply take it on its face value, that it's a way of going through and trying to better understand the procurement process. It's specifically for IT, but it could be for anything. So if your specialism is buildings or bridges or people or whatever it happens to be, think about how it might affect the way you approach it. So when you're doing the assessment, take it on face value and don't think that you have to be an IT expert to actually do the assessment. Because ITIL is simply putting a structure around procurement. It's saying that we have business needs. Those business needs may be addressed by a particular service, and in this case, the service is IT. And what they're not saying is, oh, you need to understand about Cisco or Microsoft or IBM or Netgear or SQL or Excel or anything else. It's quite specifically agnostic in the way it approaches any kind of hardware or software or organization. What it's saying is, what does this business need? And do we have some sort of service that we can use to address that need? And again, just like in many other areas, this came from a proliferation of approaches. And again, if you're responsible for a fleet in an organization, that fleet might have grown organically. You start off small and you get a small van, and then you get bigger and you get a transit van, and then you get bigger still and you get a Luton, except it's not actually a Luton, it's the Renault version of a Luton. So now you've got 3 different sizes of delivery van from 2 different manufacturers. And as your business grows, you might start buying cars, and somebody wanted, one of your sales people wanted an Audi, and someone else wanted a Vauxhall. And now you get 5 different manufacturers and 4 different types of, 4 different manufacturers and 5 different types of vehicle. All of that becomes difficult to manage. You're going to need different service contracts with Ford and Vauxhall and all the rest of them. You're going to need people that know about all those different types of vehicle. If you have in-house service people, they're going to have to understand all of those different types of vehicle in order to fix them. Wouldn't it be nicer just to have one? And you might not always manage to do it because you wouldn't have your salesperson driving about in a Luton van. Nor would you have your delivery people taking their stuff out in a Ford. I don't even know any Ford models anymore. What's a Ford car these days? I can't even think. You get the point, though. You do need different vehicles, but maybe you want to cut it down to one Ford Focus. Thank you, Sally. You wouldn't set up your deliveries in a Ford Focus. So you might think, well, okay, if we can at least get it down to one manufacturer, one supplier, that might help, because we're only having to deal with one thing. We're not going to hear one supplier say, no, it's the other supplier's fault, and vice versa. At least you can say, no, you supplied all of these things. It's your problem, not mine. And that can happen in all sorts of places. So I've used the example of vehicles. This, because it's ITIL, is clearly on IT. And the same sort of thing has happened. Many organizations grow their IT systems organically. Somebody thinks that a spreadsheet can help, so they get a PC. Someone else likes the idea, but they've heard about Macs, so they prefer getting a Mac. Then the accounts department decides, do you know what we've heard about? We've heard about this software that lets us print all our invoices and all of the paperwork that we need, but it runs on a server. So we need a server and we need some computers to connect to it. So all of this stuff grows topsy-turvy, lots of different hardware, lots of different software. And it's the same as with the vehicles. Will they talk to each other? You've got to support lots of things. And as Andrew correctly points out, that needs to be managed. There could be risks either way. You could have a risk that by having all of these different suppliers, all these different systems, the risk is that you find issues with them talking to each other. You find issues with getting enough staff to understand all these different systems. But the other side of the coin, as Andrew points out, is you might see a risk that if you move to a single supplier, what happens if they no longer exist? What if they go bust or their product goes? There's an old thing in computing. Nobody ever get blamed for buying IBM. And that addresses exactly that point that Andrew's saying. The idea is IBM are a huge company. They're a worldwide company and they've been around for a very long time. Because of that, they're used by just about everybody. So if in the end you say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy IBM equipment and IBM software, you do have that feeling of ease that they're not suddenly going to not be around. But you also have that feeling that, well, everyone else has bought IBM, so nobody can blame me for buying IBM. We're all doing it. It's the industry standard, if you like. This is an ongoing issue. So the process I've described is sort of the early days of computing, where, Windows was new, Macs was new, and that's not even the early days, that's the kind of mid days. It actually started way back when you didn't know if you were going to buy an ICL mini computer or a DEC mini or an IBM mainframe. The same things applied. Parts of the business identified a need. That need was addressed by a specific procurement process, but then whatever was procured needed to be put into the rest of the organization's systems. That can be difficult if you've got a whole bunch of standards, a whole bunch of ways that they run. And if you don't know what an operating system is, you've probably got a vague idea that there's a difference between buying a Windows computer and buying a Mac computer, or that there's a difference between an Android phone and an iOS phone. Well, it's the same idea, but on a larger scale. Do you have a Windows server, or do you have an IBM OS 360 server, or do you have, I'm not going to go through them all because there's no point, you get the idea anyway. So we have a business problem, we have a risk problem, and we also might have a compliance problem, because with all these different systems, all working to different standards, all doing things in a different way, how do we prove that we're doing things that we should be doing? How do we actually do the compliance part of GRC? So not surprisingly, one of the organisations that had this issue was the UK government. It's a big organisation, lots of different places, doing lots of different things. Clearly they got in lots of different hardware, lots of different software, and in the end struggled to make it all work together. So ITIL was actually a UK government initiative. It's been privatised now, just like everything else, but it was a UK government initiative to try and standardise. And the other thing you may have come across, I may have mentioned it before, is the idea of PDCA. Because one of the clear things that we're doing with this is trying to make sure that we plan, trying to make sure that what we've done is correct, fix it if we're not, and go back through that virtuous circle to make our stuff the best it can be. ITIL calls it something different though. It calls it the service value system. Make that a wee bit bigger for you. So the service value system takes into account all of these things. It tries to understand where there's been either a demand or possibly an opportunity. There might not be a demand to redo the invoicing systems, but if a new system comes out that can do things twice as fast with half the people, well, that might be an opportunity. But only if it provides value to the organisation. If it doesn't provide value, what's the point? So within all that, we have the ITIL process, the ITIL service value system process. And the first thing it does is it sets out some guiding principles here. And the first guiding principle it looks at is value. Is what we're doing worth it? Now, it's not just how much does it cost, it's value. And there may be different ways of measuring value to the organisation. Clearly, cost might be one, but if cost was the only value, you would never do anything because you wouldn't spend any money. What you may see instead is the opportunity to save money elsewhere, or save time, or do things that you've never done before, bring systems together to give you extra information. It depends. Value can only be defined by those who are looking at the system and know what they want to get out of it. But there has to be that focus. Will this new system generate that value. And the other thing, next thing that starts off, the next thing that it looks at in terms of guiding principles is a kind of practical one, a recognition that you can't just throw everything out. It might be nice to have a clean slate. It might be nice to start with a blank piece of paper and go, no, we're going to redo everything. But quite often you simply can't. Whether for reasons of cost or practicality or risk, and we talked about Santander 2 or 3 weeks ago, and what happened when they threw out a whole system. ITIL says, no, start where you are. Look at what you've got, and if there's stuff that's good, keep it. I think the phrase is, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Keep the good stuff and improve things where you can. You also want to take into account the PDCA cycle. So you want to progress. Take small steps, get the feedback, understand what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and if it's gone wrong, fix it, and if it's gone right, amplify it. We're also keen on making sure that we have buy-in here. So we're not doing this in secret. There should be visibility, and everyone in the organisation should get the opportunity to work with these new systems and understand what they're going to be and collaborate when we're setting them up. The next guiding principle is about this idea of working from one end to the other. It's not just about one part of the organisation. It's saying, can we work holistically and make sure that the value of that system reaches into all aspects of the organisation, or at least all aspects of the organisation where that new system will touch. There's no point putting in a new accounting system if you've still got old Bert sitting in his corner with a 20-year-old Mac, because that's the only bit of software that can do some calculation on some obscure tax law. We still have an issue there of keeping those things together. Yes, keep it simple, but keep it simple and practical. And again, you don't have to know anything about IT. You only have to have read newspapers or watch the news to understand that there's quite often been issues with large IT projects, or indeed any project. You only have to be watching the news to understand the cost overruns in HS2 or the London Underground. These things, when they get to be big, can have all sorts of issues. So if you can keep it simple, if you can keep to the practicalities of what you're doing, use the right size, something that you can understand, then that helps. And of course, quite possibly the biggest value is automate. I just mentioned Bert in the corner. Well, if you have Bert in the corner calculating something and taking that figure and putting it into another system over in the other corner of the office, someday, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and for the rest of your life, there will be an issue. Somebody will mistype a number. And that mistyped number might be caught and it might not. But anywhere you have manual parts of a system, you will have an issue. So manual work should be considered a bug. People shouldn't be involved unless they absolutely have to be. We're all okay with those guiding principles so far? Okay, so taking those on board, the next thing we have to do is get the governance on board. It doesn't matter what the governance is, what we call it, whether it's a board or a cabinet or whatever. they have to be on board. Clearly, if you're making a change, if governance systems aren't on board, then you're going to have an issue. So whatever the controlling body for the organisation is, get them on board. Next one is the PDCA stuff, the continual improvement idea. And that's the things that we've been talking about before. What is it we want to do? Where are we now? How do we get to where we want to be? How does that work? What actions do we take? What actions, when we've taken those actions, what's been the outcome? Are we moving in the right direction? Do we need to tweak it? All that stuff that we've been speaking about before is in terms of PCDA. All of that continual improvement should be in there. Then we have to decide how we're going to approach it. What practices we're going to put in place to make sure that we do this properly. Now, here's one of the places where I'm saying take ITIL at face value. And just like with the ISO standard, there's a lot going on behind the scenes, which clearly we're not going to cover in this course. And the reason I say that is that ITIL has 34 different practices. Now, they try and keep them separate and try and look at different parts of the business process. So things about just normal management, things about specific parts of the service and how those, or the service that you're creating, and how those will be managed. And of course, because it is a technical thing, there'll be a technical management part. But there are lots of them. And again, if you're not involved in IT, I don't think many of these management approaches will be unfamiliar to you. Portfolio management happens in all sorts of areas, whether it's your vehicles or your estate or anything else. You manage the portfolio of things that you have. Measurement and reporting is not unique to IT. Risk management isn't unique to IT. So whatever it is, there are general things that hopefully you can see parallels with in your own special area. Similarly, with the service management part, there are lots of things here that you'll work with on a day-to-day basis in other areas. If you're working in vehicles, people will phone up and say, my van's not starting. Yeah, okay. So you get a service desk and you have to do some incident management. And if you need to take that van off the road, you might have a capacity problem. So these, while they are within an IT specific framework, are not unusual practices in terms of management. Excuse me. Of course, the technical ones are possibly slightly more IT based. But again, I'm sure you can create your own links to your own specific areas. We talk about deploying software. You might deploy new vehicles. You might deploy staff. That thing still has to be managed, no matter what it is you're doing. So that's the service value system. And as part of that, and as part of reaching this goal of providing value, we also have a service value chain. And again, we're talking about IT, but this isn't specific. Of course you want value. Why wouldn't you want value on every system that you have? Why wouldn't you be trying to figure out whether or not there's a demand for something that you're putting in? Why wouldn't you be engaging with the people that are going to be using that system? Why wouldn't you be planning about how you implement it? Why wouldn't you be figuring out what it'll improve? Why wouldn't you be looking at existing products and services that can do those? Or looking at internal systems that might be able to provide them first. And if they don't have them, you can see this line going through it. If you can't do it internally, well, maybe there's products and services that you can just buy in, all to give you that idea of value. So the service value chain takes this plan, improve, design idea or that we've had in PDCA and simply formalizes it. Formalizes it in this case for IT, but again, the approaches, the ways you do it, are not that different in any area. What is specific is another ISO, ISO 20000, and this is for IT service management. And indeed, ISO 20000 contains lots of other standards in there. So basically, they've grabbed the good stuff that's being done and said, okay, well, this is a way to approach it. Let's take it and put it into the standard. So they've taken things from COBIT and said, yep, that's now part of the standard. They've even taken things from something called the Microsoft Operations Framework. And again, if you know what it is, great. If you don't worry about it. Because I'm sure you can get the idea from the words operations framework, how you go about operating. In this case, it's IT, but it could be anything. So they've taken that good practice and said, okay, that's now part of the standard. What's not part of the standard is the company. So it's not about Microsoft. It doesn't say you have to use Microsoft stuff or you have to follow the Microsoft way of doing it. It's simply saying that this operations framework approach is a good way to do it. So we're going to put it into the ISO standard. And of course, that's good for Microsoft because Microsoft can say, well, of course we comply with the international standard. Heck, we even contributed to it. So of course you can buy our stuff. So these things work both ways for them. Now, like most ISO standards, it's huge. We're not going to go through it all. There's links to it on your module materials in the OneNote notebook. What we're just going to look at is 20,000/1, which is the service management part. And again, it looks at those types of things that we've looked at here and looked at earlier. What's the scope of the plan? What we're going to do? What would be a normal approach? How would we actually do this? What are the definitions and terms of reference that we're going to have? What does the organization look like? All of those sorts of things are in this and allow us to approach it in the way that we need to for the organization. Not because we've heard about some cool bit of tech or some new bit of hardware that we want to play about with, but something that actually serves the business. Anybody get any questions about that? It's all gone very quiet. Nope, all happy. Okay. Well, if you're all happy, that would seem like an opposite time to take a break. So we've got a short presentation on COBIT still to come. But I think before that, we should take a break. What do you think? We take 10 minutes? And I'll see you back here in 10. Again, I'll take silence as acquiescence. Okay, I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Who knew that it took more than 10 minutes to make a cup of tea? Okay. So before the break, we were talking about ITIL. Does anyone have any questions that they've thought of since we took our break? Excuse me. No. Okay. In that case, we will move on to the second part for today, which is about COBIT, the control objectives for information and related technologies. Now, as I said before, and that's just the same slide in a different design. Same things apply if you're not an IT person. Don't worry about it. Just think of them as approaches, exemplars, however makes sense for you. And you'll see that when we look at what COBIT calls its domain model. What it does is it splits up, in this case IT, but it could be anything, it splits up into 4 elements. And planning and organising, acquiring and implementing, delivering and supporting, and monitoring and evaluating. Well, clearly COBIT's talking about IT, but those 4 things are not unique to IT, and in fact are encompassed both in ITIL and in PDCA. So it's a constant theme that we're looking at here. Figuring out what you're going to do, doing it, delivering it, checking that it's working, and then evaluating it and changing it if you have to. So we're getting that same cycle that we've seen before. And as before, and the reason we look at it as part of GRC is that by adhering to a model and an industry standard model, it ensures that all the compliance stuff that you have to do is all encompassed as part of that. So if you follow the ITIL model, the COBIT model, or whatever model it is for your industry, it means that your compliance comes as standard, if you like. It's included as part of that framework anyway. Now, for COBIT, it's about things like data retention. So if you are in a government job, you have to keep emails for, I think it's 7 years. If you work in the finance industry, you have to keep financial information, I think, for 20 years. So that's the data retention part. So if you follow these structures, it allows you to make sure that you stay compliant with the laws and regulations that apply to your type of industry. Like most of these other things, it also promises other helpful aspects. Less waste, faster response to changes in your business, lowering costs. All of these things are laudable goals. So as I say, COBIT uses domains, and it takes those domains and splits them up into different areas, things like governance and good practices. Again, that's not unique to IT. But what it tries to do, and why it's been successful, is it tries to ensure that you're thinking about the business and not just about IT. So again, it's not about, oh, look, cool new IT toy, let's get it in and we'll use it in the business. It's about, what does the business need to do? Excuse me. What does the business need to do? And are there things that we can do to facilitate that? Because it's business oriented, what it also tries to do is not talk about IT, or at least not talk about IT as a specialism. So things like the language that's used isn't about SQL or DNS or firewall or any of the technical terms. It's about a common language that everyone can understand about what's going on. It's not about firewall. It's about keeping internal systems away from external influences. The fact that that's a firewall and how that works, who cares? It's about the business process. And again, as with PDCA that we've looked at before, as with ITIL that we've just looked at, COBIT also encourages this idea of plan, build, run, monitor. Plan what you're doing first, build it, implement it, and monitor whether it's working or not, and go through it again. And of course, you don't know whether it's working unless you've created your objectives. And again, we talked about that a few weeks ago. You don't know if you've reached your target unless you set the target before you start. And it means you can't cheat if you don't set it first. You can't just say, oh yes, well, it's doing this and I'm happy with that. No, decide what you want it to do first and then see whether you have reached that goal. And because all of these things will have to be progressed, and because there are people whose job it will be to do these sorts of things, then COBIT also includes management guidelines about how you do that, how you'd actually agree on an objective. How do you actually measure performance? Because we've been talking about it as a nice goal, but we haven't specifically said this is how you do it. What is a performance level? What is a key performance indicator, and who decides? Well, COBIT tries to help you through that process. And it also tries to decide whether or not there are gaps in your processes and whether they're mature enough to do everything that you need to do. So again, these are IT specific in terms of their ITIL and COBIT, but the ways that they approach things and the sorts of things that they take into account and their iterative nature of PDCA and all that kind of stuff can apply anywhere. Any questions on those? No? Okay, well, as part of your tutorial this afternoon, this is what you'll be doing. And what I want you to do is look at these frameworks, the specific ones and the general ones. Think about how they use PDCA and how that might be helpful in terms of your case study. And of course, this is for the MSc students, not the CPD students who don't have a tutorial this afternoon. Okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to stop the recording.